Well, hello all, and welcome to our weekly survey of Leonard Peikoff's outstanding works. And today we have a special one. This was his presentation in which he reviewed the triumphs and tribulations of a talk show host. From 1995 through 1999, Leonard Peikoff hosted a nationally syndicated talk radio show focusing on philosophy and culture. And
he did, and he covered so many interesting issues from a unique perspective. And each and every time he reduced it to philosophical principles. Unlike any other, talk radio was taking over America in the 1990s, especially right-wing thinkers, but thinkers across the spectrum were doing important radio shows in the 1990s, and it was becoming a very, very hot thing. Rush Limbaugh came onto the scene. Howard Stern was hot on the scene. But Peikoff's was an unusual radio show that tried to understand the world from a philosophical perspective. And this talk is really fascinating because he talks about his experiences trying to, as he says, mainline philosophy straight into culture. Sort of like Ayn Rand did through novels, get philosophical ideas into the mainstream of the culture, sort of bypassing normal academic route through philosophy. Now, can't totally bypass that. That's important. But through this, he wanted to, as he says, mainline philosophy straight into the culture. And he had surprising successes and he had surprising failures that I think we can learn from.
Yes. Just taking a look at a little technical difficulty here, making sure our video is going through. In the meantime, I will hold up. I have a show and tell for the class here. We remember the old style Impact magazine and the newsletter of the Ayn Rand Institute.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah.
So we have the announcement in December of 1995. The Leonard Peikoff Show debuts in LA. Leonard Peikoff began a weekly radio show on Sunday, November 12th. The Leonard Peikoff Show airs live every Sunday.
Those of us in Southern California were kind of spoiled because it broadcast out of LA from a pretty big station. So if you're in Southern California, you could probably get it. But it was syndicated to several other markets. It wasn't it was never, Rush Limbaugh, but he did have tens of thousands of regular viewers. So he did get onto the map, as it were, for opinion talk shows at the time.
Yes, and that was interesting to me too, looking this up, because I remembered, wait, wasn't the show called Philosophy Who Needs It? But it did go through an evolution. It started out on that one station in LA. Before he was done, it was syndicated. I forget the number of markets. I know there were 4 big stations, but the number of listeners.
Wasn't it like 6 markets or something, as I recall?
Yeah, a large number of aggregate listeners.
Mm-hmm.
He ran the show through 1999. Again, by the end, it had been changed to, the name was Philosophy Who Needs It.
Yes.
Apropos of the philosophy he was talking about. And
if you think about it, it's kind of stunning the success, the degree to even the success that he had. He's a philosopher. And he is, as I say, trying to reduce these issues to their philosophical meaning and philosophical principles. And you'd think on the face of it, is the radio audience of America, driving to and from work or something, or listening to a radio somewhere on the beach, are they really going to tune in to someone talking philosophy to them? I think that when you put it in that context, he had remarkable success.
Yes. And he went on from there. From 2006 to 2007, he went to the internet and was answering questions through his website. And then from 2007 to 2016, which I didn't even realize it was that long, he was doing his podcast. So this broadcast experience, these 4 years in the late 90s were the start of that, but it didn't end there. It was interesting to me too. He gave this talk at Lyceum conferences. It's triumphs and I love that he used triumphs and tribulations. Usually the expression is trials and tribulations, but he did have triumphs. And it's fun now because with people like Yaron Brook as the big voice in objectivism, he tells stories, or you hear the stories from the individuals of people. Oh, I discovered Ayn Rand through listening to you. I discovered Ayn Rand when I saw you on this television. And that's fun because it reminds me of all the people I've heard who said, oh yeah, I discovered Ayn Rand because I heard Leonard Peikoff on a radio show in Los Angeles, or I saw him on Politically Incorrect. And he was such an ambassador for the philosophy at that point.
Yeah, he appeared on several major national television. Back in the 20th century, in the days before the internet, people depended upon television in those prehistoric times. And he appeared on several important. I mean, he not only did C-SPAN informational stuff, but he would also do the Bill O'Reilly Show or the Bill Maher Show, Politically Incorrect. He appeared on several important TV shows in this period as well.
He began the talk by saying, "We gave this title, What I Have Learned from Being on the Radio. The main thing was to see whether it's possible, by being on the radio, to merchandise philosophy to a broader audience than normally reads philosophic books or even philosophical novels, whether there's a way to mainline philosophy into the arteries of America without going through the educational system." And then he shares his insights from that over the course of the next hour and a half.
Given the state and monopolistic, barriers that universities generally present, for academics with different ideas, like objectivists, the idea was bypass academia. Now, at the end of the day, we can't totally bypass academia. That's, where minds are trained. But if we could mainline, the idea he had at the time was if we could mainline, just as Rand did with her novels, straight into American culture, get some better philosophical ideas working into the mainstream of American thought.
The universities won't accept people like Tara Smith or Greg Salmieri or C. Bradley Thompson or any of the victories that we've made in the universities without at least some cultural penetration as well. Otherwise, their students wouldn't tolerate it and the faculties wouldn't bring it on. So I think there have been these victories, and I've talked about that before. But I'm also interested in, for those of us who are here now in 2022 and carrying on the fight in our small way or in larger ways, the lessons that he learned 2 years in, because this was right in the middle of his radio career that he gave this talk, but the lessons he learned 2 years in, I think a lot of these apply to me and you and all of us who are trying to speak out in the name of these ideas.
Absolutely. In fact, they apply to everyone, even in their, a lot of this advice is, I think, applicable across the board in any interaction that we have where we're trying to get across an idea or make a substantive point, even in a cocktail party conversation.
Yes, absolutely. He says one of the tricks of the show was not to give a long diatribe at the beginning, but to have it ready in pieces. And then when each caller, you would give them one little bit so that it didn't sound too preachy.
And try and bring it out from the caller. He'd have his outline of points that he wanted to present, and then with the appropriate caller, this is the time to put that idea in, so that by the time it was all done, he had developed all of his points, and then he could have a conclusion.
Yes.
I liked his question. He asked, does morality even matter? Is it just an obstacle that, you can just not worry about? Does anybody, consider morality be important in your life? And people would call in and he would kind of weed out those folks who were
total cynics,
total cynics. And then he would find somebody who would say, yes, I think, honesty is a virtue. And then he would ask them, well, why do you think that? And then they would get into more of the reality-based arguments for honesty, and it would be a springboard for that. So it was wonderful that he was able to kind of just on the fly, get people to, to answer. He would weed some of those folks out. He would keep some of the others, and he would basically bring out the best in those people who are talking. To make some points that he wanted to bring out.
One of the failures he noted was the direct approach. He had a couple of shows, a series of shows called Philosophy Who Needs It, where he took head on, okay, we're going to talk philosophy and the importance of philosophy. That did not work. On the other hand, why do we need morality? Without God, why be moral? The right. Dostoevsky question, right? Yeah. So he just throws that out theoretically and then elicits it from the audience and their real world experience.
And then people call in and say, well, you can't cheat. You can't lie.
Yeah, that wouldn't work. It wouldn't be good for me in the long run. Aha! That would, because he's now inductively eliciting it from them so that now he can come back and make a principled point that in fact his callers were the ones who gave the substance behind, which I think tells us something. there's a point he makes that's really good here. When you take on the abstract and the theoretical from the outset, you're going to turn off a good deal of an audience, especially a wide general radio audience. On the other hand, it's not philosophy at all. Some of the most big successes, surprising successes he had, were profoundly philosophical questions. About perfection, for example. Is moral perfection possible? So it's not that philosophic ideas don't sell. In fact, if you have something like, what's the meaning of life, right? Those kind of ideas can sell. It depends on how you elicit it, how you go about it. If you go about it from a fact, especially as a talk show host, he could elicit it from the call-in show. He could elicit it from the audience, and that was a much more inductive and much more persuasive, powerful, emotionally real, factually connected way of doing it for the audience. So it's not philosophy as such. People are interested in philosophic ideas. What's the meaning of life? Is perfection possible? Those were big hits. Big hits. Whereas if he said philosophy, who needs it, abstractly from the outset, yawn, you turn people off already. So it's not philosophy itself, because people are interested in philosophy. It's getting them to see the reality and the importance of philosophy with their own eyes and make the connection with their own experience that I think is the critical lesson here.
I think so too. In fact, that's what stood out in all the examples was you're not only letting the caller be an asset to your radio program by leading it through and getting him to say things, but more than that, it's you're showing that the value of these ideas depends on the person you're talking to seeing them firsthand.
Right.
So it's a first-handed approach rather than a preaching approach that he found most effective. And it stands to reason given the philosophy. It was great fun as he goes through because he broke the talk down into 5 shows that didn't work and were surprises. He expected them to be successes and they completely, in his words, bombed. And then 5 shows that were enormously successful that were also surprises. And I just want to pull a couple examples out of here. For example, the very first one he mentions, he says that the first show was a show on Freud. And this was interesting to me because it surprised me that it surprised him. He says, I thought, well, gee, Freud is in all the movies and everybody in Los Angeles, he was local at the beginning, everybody in Los Angeles is in psychotherapy. So it should be a good show.
And it seems that way sometimes. And those who aren't probably should be.
Yeah. He expected a lot of callers. He expected a big reaction. And there were no callers. There was just nobody. And he talked at the time to a programming director who worked at the station, somebody he had great respect for. He mentions him a couple times, a gentleman named Dick Sinclair. And Sinclair said to him, well, do not put on a show in which the audience doesn't have in advance a very strong position. It's interesting because it's so easy to say they should care about this, but they don't.
Well, if I were to give something about an intellectual that people don't have a confident grip on, I mean, who's read Freud? Freud's written influential books, The Interpretation of Dreams, Civilization and Its Discontents, books that have had a big influence, but it's mostly been in the intellectual world. And the ordinary American doesn't have a strong opinion on Freud. They're not sure about Freud. And if they're not sure about it, they're not going to, have an opinion on it or get emotionally worked up about it at all. So I think he makes a really good point. If it's too detached from someone's, we'll take a philosophical idea like the primary-secondary distinction. If you were to make a radio show out of that, I doubt you'd get any viewers or callers at all. It depends on how the issue is approached. You could maybe take the same issue and give a concrete instance from a news story that people have a strong opinion on and back into it. But if you were to start out with a technical issue or even an intellectually important writer like Freud, you're just not going to get people's interest.
Yes. And that relates to the second example he gives and all of us at ARCUK need to bear this in mind. He said, we had a couple of shows specifically on philosophy, who needs it? And he thought, well, we'll hit him directly with the philosophy. And he said, you learned that you cannot concretize it at that broad a level of abstraction. It's too broad. It's too abstract. And there's no way to turn that into a radio program. And it just makes me think, well, there's one we need to remember here on the ARCUK. Looking at the view counts of our own shows, we have some shows that skyrocket, and you're like, I didn't think that was going to go. Exactly. And then you realize, but it's something people can connect to right away.
Exactly right.
For Valentine's Day, he wanted to talk about sex. And
what could possibly sell better?
Yeah, I know, really. Exactly.
Can't go wrong with
Everyone's
that.
getting in the mood for Valentine's
Day. Totally bombed. It totally bombed. And then one of his friends or producer, somebody in the industry said, you have to realize that for the most people who are listening to your show, sex is something of the past.
And he learned about demographics.
Then he learned about demographics. Oh, so hilarious.
Yeah, it's another one Dick Sinclair helped him with.
Our 20 and 30-year-olds we're talking about. These are 60-year-olds we're talking about with a different context. Yeah, it was kind of amusing.
It was funny because we know that Leonard Peikoff is a randy old man. Into his 70s, he was still talking about how people say these kids these days aren't interested in sex. I'm still interested in sex. I don't think he understood just how many people reach that age and start setting that part of their lives aside. So that was an interesting anecdote.
Dr. Peikoff is a personal inspiration to me in that regard, I must say.
He'll never get old.
To us as well.
Leonard Peikoff will never get old. He may be gone someday, but he'll never get old.
Never get old.
And then the final one that he was baffled about was, and this is another one that hits home with me, if you know the shows I do with Amy on ARCUK, but also our Sunday shows where we talk even more in this kind of big, glowing, touchy-feely way. He did a show called Life is Worth Living Even Today. Call for optimism. For all the things going wrong, and he said 1,000 things that he had on the list.
Can you be positive? Can you be, right. Everyone's calling for optimism. That's what's going to sell.
Yes. They would call in, they would complain to him and say, can't you talk about something optimistic? All these horrible news stories, blah, blah, blah. And then when he does it,
nobody calls.
Yawn.
And he did say that's the one of the 5 that he didn't have an explanation for. He didn't know why that one bombed so badly.
I have a theory of my own.
Why is that?
Because you'll see it in what we're doing here at ARCUK, our good works here. And you've got usually when there's something very emotional and something people have, like they said, you have to have a firm opinion about it. And it has to rally you up, and then you'll have callers kind of thing. Right. And so, I've noticed that, when Yaron Brook talks about something that's, very positive, he laments, I don't have as much viewers. And my theory is that, I think, for better or for worse, human beings have at least some people have a tendency towards the negativity bias. And it's the
shootings and car crashes that actually get people to watch the television news or to click onto an internet news site.
We have talked about that. There's a reason why good news isn't news. And the reason is if things are good, there's nothing you have to do about it.
Right.
It's all good at that point.
Now, another example he had was the 10 things wrong with the Constitution. And I think the simple explanation there, 10 is just crow busting. If he'd had something like the fatal flaw of the Constitution, or the 2 fatal flaws of the Constitution, that might have been a better sell. But you can't overload people either, even if you have an interesting, controversial topic.
No, you're driving down the street in your car listening to him. You're like, oh, the 5th one is interesting, but what was the last 4 he said?
Exactly. In the middle, I'm lost, right? But that's exactly it.
Now, on the bright side, on the list of ones that went extremely well, and we've talked about this before because, of course, we've talked about A Picture is Not an Argument, which went on to become one of his great talks at Fort Hall Forum, but started out as his response to this abortion debate he was going to be involved in, apropos of the news this week. We've managed to avoid that so far during this hour, but he was going to go to this debate. I think everybody knows the story. A little bit before the debate was to happen, the people called him up to get his pictures, his movies, the presentations he was going to use on his side. He's like, well, what do you mean movies? I mean, we're talking.
I thought this was going to be a debate between philosophers. What do movies come in?
And they said, well, we're going to have our movies, and we'll be showing some movies of what an abortion looks like and pictures of the babies. And
of course.
And he pulled out of the debate, and he had to talk about it on the radio show because he had publicized it on the radio. And so he did this episode on A Picture Is Not an Argument. And he says he actually got a great response to that. People did get it, that people were using pictures in order to emotionally load the discussion so there would be no logical argument.
That's it. An argument is a way of bypassing a conceptual, logical argument for your case. It's a way of appealing directly to emotions. It's total subjectivism. And at some level, his audience, his non-objectivist audience, got it.
Yes.
Got it. They understood that they were being emotionally manipulated, and that their rational process was being bypassed. And he could really make that point. It's really surprising that there's certain, not just ethical and political points, which you think might get attention, right? But purely epistemological points that people were responding to. And that I find utterly fascinating. People are hungry for deeper abstract philosophy, but they have to immediately, and in the first instance, see the reality of it, the importance of it, have some idea of it, and then we've got the hook. We can actually then bring those experiences in and help explain those experiences. That's where I think we have, in terms of appealing to a mass audience, our best bet in getting philosophical ideas through. Totally challenging. I mean, because you notice the other talk show hosts of his time, people like Rush Limbaugh and Howard Stern and Dr. Laura Schlesinger, who were the big radio hosts of the 1990s, they avoided philosophy to some extent. Limbaugh remained political. Dr. Laura had a moral element, but an ultra-conservative moral element. And Howard Stern, he was just sort of a decadent emotionalist, spouting out whatever would shock his audience that day.
Yeah. Now, I have to say, though, I think part of the answer, too, was clever marketing. Not just marketing, but the way in which he appealed to the audience, saying a picture is not an argument. Anybody could, if he had gone before them and said, today I'm going to talk about argumentum ad passionis, right. The logical fallacy of the appeal to emotion
or appeal to, right, exactly. They wouldn't have gotten the logical fallacy idea.
And Freud as well.
Freud,
right. And I mentioned that because in the next example he gives, he talks about his show called Dirty Words.
Right.
And again, this is brilliant because
because if he'd said anti-concepts or invalid concepts,
right,
people would have thought, oh, this is a technical issue. But he says dirty words. And by that, I mean the corruption of language itself. Okay, I've got you. And again, the people could feel, yes, you're right. Words are being manipulate me almost in an Orwellian way or in an anthem-like way. And you could get them at that level.
Right. Dirty words is a kind of an expression that snares you and you think of dirty words. But even after that,
the audience, right?
But even after that bit of titillation, the people know what dirty fighting is.
Yes.
People know what dirty tactics are.
Right.
He was making the point that these anti-concepts aren't just this philosophical abstraction where that word is right. No, this is dirty fighting. These are dirty words.
Right. And people could see that extremism is a pretty empty thing. Right? Hey, wait a minute. What's a concept like extremism?
Yeah.
What are you really getting at? Don't you want to be extremely happy, extremely successful? What's wrong with extremes as such? And people already had this sense that, wait a minute here. Extremism isn't the problem. Violence may be the problem. Right? And so you make those kind of distinctions and you elicit it again from his audience.
Right. So it was very, very, he found it very interesting. And I think it is very interesting how just the regular audience will call in and express their concern for defining words precisely and speaking precisely, and even knowing what the etymology of a certain word is or a phrase. So that really surprised him. But, of course, that's, it's a wonderful thing to witness that people are actually value precise word usage. And just as an aside real quick, there's a podcast on right now, not right now, but out there in podcast land called A Way with Words. And it's basically two people who have studied language and the etymology of words and the backgrounds and the origins of phrases. And people call into that show all the time, and they have no limit to the questions that they field. And I just find that very interesting.
Very interesting. See, people do have an interest even in epistemology at a practical, real world, concrete level. And if you can give them that relevance, if you can connect it to what's going on in their personal lives or in politics of the day, then suddenly you've got them. They can see the relevance, and they've got concrete examples in their own life, and they've got an emotional connection to it. And they can see the importance at the end of the day of an abstract idea, even in epistemology.
Well, speaking of questions, I do have to take just a moment to say thank you to our super chatters in the chat on YouTube. You should be in there. You should be asking questions. If you put a few dollars on them, you support ARCUK, assuming, of course, you're already a member by going to AynRandCenter.co.uk and click Be a Member. Link will be in the chat in just a moment. But thank you very much to Kirk Wilcox in for $2. We do appreciate that. Apollo Zeus followed it up with £2. Well, that's even a little. We all know about it, the exchange rate. Thank you for that. And finally, Bonnie with a $5 question. This is absolutely worth the dollars because she asks or says, I always want to bring things back to volition because that's what I care about. But he shows how that's not an effective way to go. Thanks, Dr. Peikoff. He does show that, but I think he's showing that it can be effective, but he can't just hammer it into people. Yeah, you can't just say, well, that's an issue of free will, and you just forget everything you're talking about because I'm going to tell you the way it is.
Better approach. Again, this is an example. Bonnie, thank you very much. I think that I would use the same principle that we were talking about just a little bit earlier. It depends on your approach. If I were to say, in defense of free will, or I'm opposed to determinism, you'd turn people off. Okay, that's an abstract philosophical point. I don't, what, huh? Whereas if you were to, we did the psychology of psychologizing earlier this week, where Ayn Rand does this article on the fallacy of either excusing or blaming people based on their alleged psychological diagnosis. Well, there are many concrete examples of that, where, say, criminals are being, they're getting all kinds of sympathy and we shouldn't be mean to the criminal because he couldn't really help it. When it comes to a concrete like that, can criminals help it? Should criminals even be punished? People will have strong opinions on that. Yes. And that's the way to back into, you see, the philosophic idea of volition. First, they have to see the concrete relevance of the issue. And then you've got a reason to start explaining the more abstract, deeper philosophical point like volition. Well, these leftists who think it should all be rehabilitation and social work and people shouldn't go to prison even if they commit violent crimes, that's a belief in determinism. It is the doubting of volition that underlies all of that. So if you can give a concrete, or probably one that's connected to headlines or current events or something in their personal lives, then you've got the hook. They'll see it. They'll fill in the concretes and the emotional relevance. So I think it's how you approach the philosophical issue.
And I always admire, especially in regard to Bonnie, because she's so engaged with the connecting topics between metaphysics and epistemology, the so-called anti-room. I don't know anybody who understands volition, free will, and the basic choice to focus, the commitment to focus better than she does. So thank you very much for that. In regard to, I have to go back to the membership because there's one more thing I didn't mention. I usually save this for the end. If you become a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK's YouTube group, so there's the website, but also YouTube now offers this. There are special benefits you get. You not only get the special icon that shows you're a member, you're supporting ARCUK, but there are some fun little things like these emojis, and it looks like just today.
Icons, yeah, just actually within the last 10 minutes.
They've added Amy to the list of emojis that are available.
And Robert. And, so all you need to do is refresh your browser and you'll be able to look that up.
Or just wait till next time. But they are there, and that is yet one more reason to sign up on the YouTube site as well.
It's only like $5 a month.
Yeah,
It's like, just don't get your caramel mocha latte for once a month and you'll be covered.
Starbucks, yeah.
Yeah, just
That's right.
don't go to
And
Starbucks for one time.
This Sunday, for regular paid subscribers of Ayn Rand Center UK, we're starting a whole new workshop on Dr. Leonard Peikoff's magnificent, revolutionary book on historiography, The Ominous Parallels, which discusses the rise of Nazism and America today and compares the two. It is a brilliant book, and we're just starting on Sunday. So if you become a paid subscriber to ARCUK now, you'll be able to participate from the ground floor on our new Sunday workshop on Dr. Peikoff's amazing book, The Ominous Parallels.
And I can't recommend that highly enough. If you know anything about World War II, the millions of people that were killed, but also the impact that had on communist Russia, Soviet Union, what that meant, how that then infected, the same ideas infected the United States, the universities in the 60s. This is not just a book about World War II or just a book about the philosophy of history, although it is, but it is amazing how it applied. Well, we discussed this a few weeks ago. Find the show that we did on the spirit of the 60s if you want to know, well, but does the Ominous Parallels have anything to say about life now? It absolutely does. James, these are going to be outstanding sessions and
more
something
relevant
to look forward
to. More important than ever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, going from World War II to something a little brighter, the third example Leonard Peikoff
Yes,
gives.
back to this.
I love this because we talked about how, you can't give people something too abstract. Too abstract can work. And this goes to the Q&A when somebody says, well, what about religion? That works. And he'll answer that. But even before that, he did a show on what's the meaning of life? Mm-hmm. Now, you would think that's broad. Isn't that as broad as all of philosophy? But that's a question people have tackled before. So if you ask people, what's the meaning of life? And he found this, the lines light up. And that's kind of a great story to hear because, again, that relates to what we do here.
I love the example he gave, too. On the one hand, he's got the extremely religious person who said the meaning of life is the next dimension and my life after death, not this life at all. And then you've got the complete materialist on the other side who said, what was her line? Cadillac.
Clothes. Yeah, Cadillacs.
Clothes, Cadillacs. Except men. Exactly. So you've got the two extremes there. One, a totally mystic, intrinsicist view of the meaning of life, and the other, a totally concrete, bound, pragmatist, subjectivist view of morality.
And very California.
And very California, by the way. But there, what that does is it provides an opening for an unconventional answer that is more satisfying than either of the ideas that are basically coming in from both sides. And again, you can, if you elicit it in concrete terms from the viewers, you say, well, yeah, what gives your life meaning? Your career, your romantic life. What is it that gives your life meaning? And then now we're talking about the concretes that make up your actual life, and that it's life that's sort of an end in itself and gives meaning to life. So it's, yes. It's really, it isn't the abstraction of the issue. It really is how we approach the issue. That will either connect or disconnect with people. But again, what's astonishing is that a meta-ethical issue like that is actually got the lines, the phone lines firing up on his radio show. Very, very instructive.
Yes, and useful, because if you can get people in, it's either mysticism or materialism, then you can show how a rational philosophy actually gives you access both to higher, what we can call spiritual or psychological values, as well as concrete values without being mystical or determinist. I love that, love that, love that. And then the fourth example he gives similarly, he would do shows on the virtue of selfishness, which is an easy way to get people into the book. But what really sold was he did a show, he just flipped it around. He did a show on the evil of sacrifice.
Yep.
Now, how many people have the wrong idea of what sacrifice is? How many movies do we see end with a big self-sacrifice at the end as if that's the greatest thing you can do? And Leonard Peikoff does an episode of the evil of sacrifice.
See, I think in our contemporary world, most people have a grip on the idea that, well, yeah, we have to be selfish sometimes. And some selfishness, I guess, taking care of myself, if you call that selfishness, wanting happiness, wanting a successful career or a successful love life. People have an idea that some selfishness may be okay. A much more powerful attack, a much more direct and emotional attack, is when you take on the word sacrifice. Because he had callers who said everything that you have to causally pay for in life is a sacrifice. You can't avoid sacrifice. And then you've got the other people, sort of the psychological determinists, who say there's no such thing as sacrifice. People are always doing what they want. Psychological egoism. We're all egoists under the skin. And it gave, again, the false alternative gave him the perfect opening to give the objectivist answer that resolves both ends of it. Right. Transcends the false dichotomy, as it were.
Yes, that kind of, I won't say reframing, but or not even redefining, but simply defining what you mean by sacrifice is so powerful, especially the way Leonard Peikoff talks about it. Yes. And you can get people, obviously he did get people, he got the response. And you ask the average reasonably psychologically healthy American, well, do you believe in self-determination? Do you believe in self-direction? Do you believe there's so many ways in which they do believe in self-responsibility? And great to hear that. The final example he gave, a show that was surprising. He did a show on perfection with the title, Is Perfection Possible? Now there's a tough one.
My absolute favorite. My absolute favorite. And his approach to it was brilliant. His approach to it was brilliant. Of course, people are going to, having been trained in this idea that perfection is impossible by these Platonic-leaning philosophers, right? We're trained. I come into a mathematics class. There's no perfect circle, of course, and of course, you go to an ethics class. Of course, the standards of ethics, like altruism, can never be lived up to. So ethics can't really be. But what's amazing is that a subject like perfection, he could actually elicit. He'd get the caller on. And then he would say, well, let's talk about your life. Are you doing the best you can here? Mm-hmm. Tell me what you're doing. Are you a derelict on some important thing you think you should be doing?
No, not doing any of those things.
No, I'm working hard. I'm thinking about what I'm doing. I'm trying to improve myself. And Dr. Peikoff would say, well, then you are perfect. And he would force these reluctant admissions from people. A lot of good people are out there. And so he's forcing these reluctant admissions from people. I'm perfect?
You're not doing anything wrong. Everything you're doing is right.
It was such an excellent example of trying to show people the power of contextual thought.
Right.
That isn't some sort of like a Platonic ideal that that you cannot ever reach. That it's something that actually applies to your life, and it's something that it's a concept of perfect that you can actually use to ask yourself, am I doing what is good here? Based on my requirements for life as a human being. It's contextual to that, or I think as I recall, some of these things that he was talking about, it brought back actually listening to these shows when they first came out, which I'm obviously a vampire, so I'm not,
you're too young to have heard that in the late 90s.
Yeah, I'm too young to have learned. Yeah, so. I just recall that it was just so, it was like a deliverance when he was talking with people. They're like, oh, and he did the same thing with morality as well. He said, same kind of thing with morality. He talked about morality, he talked about the reality basis of it. And he asked people, what they thought of themselves and the kinds of things that they do for a living, and that they hold down a job, that they're productive, that they're honest, and that they value rationality. And the kind of responses he would get from his callers were just wonderful to hear, because it was like this lightning, was this lift, like, oh, we didn't have to take all of it seriously, did we? Kind of reaction. And it was such a joy. It was
traditional approaches to morality just don't give people what they need.
Right.
And they're imposing all kinds of unearned guilt. Religious morality, in particular, will impose unearned guilt on people. But even left-wing political ethical values will put all kinds of unearned guilt on people. What's really beautiful to watch is Leonard Peikoff sort of delivering the real life, living your life, the psychological impact value of objectivist ethics Life is for successful living. It's for enjoying life. It is for your life. And if someone's imposing on you some kind of unearned guilt because of their twisted view of ethics, reject that. And what it does is it actually gets people to realize the importance of morality. Yeah, this idea that I could never be perfect has put me in this constant shame position.
Right.
And when you can connect those dots like that, you've actually given people a profound new insight and a profound new self-esteem, a profound new ease in enjoying life. We've actually delivered this person by person, and you hear him do it on these calls. You're absolutely right, person by person. And you could tell he was touching them, reaching their minds, reaching their souls, and making a difference to them, telling them the importance of ideas in the process. Really an amazing skill he had, really.
Yeah.
Astonishing.
It is.
You know, and you also got all kinds of other good things from his show. You got his sense of humor, which he is one of the cleverest, funniest, wittiest men I've ever known. You get his benevolence. You get his childlike benevolence when you listen to these shows. He was he complained about his technique as a talk show host. When he'd get excited, he'd have a high pitched. The pitch of his voice would go up and stuff.
And Andrew Lewis would have to say, tone it down, or
tone it down,
say, modulate.
Modulate. Because being a radio broadcaster or a television broadcaster is a specific skill, and there's specific aptitudes that go with it, like a nice deep, low, nice sounding voice. But the truth is, it's remarkable how much success just with the content he had here to get philosophical ideas through. And I think he had just a friendly enough personality that he really could connect with people and does connect with people. And I think that's important too. Just that human connection with people and their real lives, which is really important.
Yeah. And not to mention, I don't know if you mentioned this earlier, Robert, but he started his show with his piano playing. It was the song, I believe, that he actually wrote, that he performed. And I really wish that I could get the tune in my head now, because it was so benevolent and so jaunty.
Yeah, as I recall, he told the story that it was a piece of music that Ayn Rand remembered from her youth. She could never track it down again. Leonard Peikoff found the sheet music and learned to play it.
Now, that was Canadian Capers.
No, that wasn't Canadian Capers. Absolutely not.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yes.
All right.
But it's 100-year-old tiddlywink music.
Cross-reference that.
Yes.
And make sure that we may both be wrong about that, although there's an element of truth in both of those.
I thought it was a piece that he wrote himself, but I may be wrong.
Leonard
but it was
that
so
could
sweet.
be too.
No concert pianist, but nothing is more charming than when Leonard Peikoff would sit down at the piano in his home and start playing.
Yes.
I had that pleasure more than once. I have to say. So.
And I have to go back to the beginning, because I know that the stream started late, although it will be when the show is finished, it will appear for folks who missed the beginning because the streaming started late. But we mentioned that one of the great things about reviewing this, and Leonard Peikoff's review of his 4 years, even if in the end they decided to wrap up the radio show and there were other ways that he was going to reach people, it didn't turn out to be the way that objectivism was going to save the world, except he did reach countless people and he did hear back from them. And he actually talks about this in the Q&A. One of the questioners asks, are there things that are positive now, new views that you have about what's happening in people's minds that are on the positive level? And Leonard Peikoff answers in part. He says, you pretty regularly come up with people who say, I listen to your show all the time. I never took any philosophy. I've never read any of this stuff, but it makes sense. I disagree with you on this or that, and he says, they get hooked, and it's a very satisfying thing. You can actually reach people this way, and people would come up to Leonard Peikoff the same way again that they do now with Yaron Brook and say, yeah, I never really got into Ayn Rand until I heard your podcast or your radio show or your Q&A online or your appearance on Politically Incorrect or Bill O'Reilly back when that was a thing. The biggest thing. So many people were affected by this, and it's hard to know who those people affected and what impacts. All we know is unquestionably massive, and there are countless people, and we're on the list, who are grateful to Dr. Peikoff for having done that.
I've met numerous people who were introduced to objectivism through either Dr. Peikoff's radio show, his television appearances, or his podcasts. Multiple people, numerous people who are like that. It's interesting the sorts of things that will hook people. Obviously, Rand, as a novelist, understood this and knew how to sell philosophy very, very well, concretely in terms of a romantic story. And that is ultra powerful in terms of mainlining philosophic ideas into a culture. But we're not, I'm not an artist on the scale of Ayn Rand, but I would like to learn the lessons from Rand and Peikoff on how to penetrate the culture and get through to people with abstract ideas, and at least get the idea of the importance of philosophy through to people, the importance of reason, the importance of ethics as a topic. If you can get that across to people, you're halfway home. But they've got to see it in terms of their own concretes in their own lives. They've got to have some real emotional connection to it. Hopefully they've already got a strong opinion about the issue you're going to use to hook them in. And it's not philosophy, as I say, not even abstract philosophy that's turning people off. It's how we approach it. It's how we develop it. If we can develop it from the ground up, from a news headline, from a concrete in people's lives at the time up, we're far more likely to get their emotional attention and get them to pay attention to our argument than if we start out with some abstract theoretical approach, start out with metaphysics, existence exists. That's much less likely to have a success, especially with a mass audience.
In the Q&A, somebody mentioned, I didn't recognize who it was, but he asked, has this experience of having this radio show and talking to regular people helped or informed your understanding of induction? And he said, yes, it's definitely been a factor. It's definitely been a factor for my understanding. And he went on to say that, deductive reasoning is, you cannot use deductive reasoning.
Well, not in the radio program format.
Not in that kind of situation. And that, he has found it helpful to understand induction. Just by talking with people and trying to, and understanding how to communicate with them, how to actually teach them these things or engage them or get them excited about ideas and concepts and epistemology. And
right.
One of the things that actually Amy Peikoff came up with at the time was this idea of having a common denominator episode. They called it
right.
Tie-in shows.
Tie-ins.
Yes. And then they would take, two ideas, people, place, things, whatever it is, Beethoven and metaphysics or a current event of some kind, taxation and Mozart, and they would tie those ideas in, and people found that really fascinating.
They do. They like a challenge. That's the other thing.
Yep.
If you throw out a challenge to people, they're going to, well, this is a mystery. This is a puzzle. This is, a Rubik's Cube I want to solve. And I want to impress your audience that I've got the answer.
Yes.
People's, natural feelings when you pose a question, a mystery, and, who's going to win, get the right answer, suddenly you stimulate interest that way.
Yeah,
there are a variety of ways you can do that. He said prizes always work.
Yes, he did have prizes, and mentioning people's name on air. Was a really wonderful thing.
Exactly right. Yeah. One of the other things that he said and that he's repeatedly stated is that he felt radio was a conceptual mode of communication as opposed to television and video.
Yes.
In this age of podcasts where we're sort of doing this hybrid, it's an interesting thing to think about, because if you think about it, it's like John Galt doing his radio broadcast. It was just a voice. Right? And she just describes the voice. So it's pure mind-to-mind conceptual communication without any visual distraction at all. Whereas if you put something on television, or if you give people visuals, they expect visuals. They want something exciting to see, something interesting to see. And if you don't give them the visuals, and again, you're sort of sliding into the picture as an argument sort of thing if you rely too much on visuals. So he found radio to be far superior to any kind of, the idea of even doing any kind of television. And I have to say, in my own experience, that is also true. We did an interview with Dr. Leonard Peikoff back in 1995, 96 for a pilot for a talk show, Ideas in Action. We won an industry
such
award.
a good episode.
We won industry awards for doing it and so forth, but the only way we could even get away with it was by going into Dr. Peikoff's home and doing an examination of his art, looking at the art, because he had Frank O'Connor's and Capoletti's and amazing statues. And again, Dr. Peikoff played the piano for us. So if you don't have some kind of audio-visual material to engage the eyes and to connect people with, it's just never going to work on television. But also to that extent, it's going to be distracting. And if I compare it, another experience I had was as a local commentator. When I was a deputy district attorney in San Diego, more than one local news station would have me on to comment on legal, political, historical issues. And so I was somewhat frequently on local news as a commentator on more than one station. You have to talk in teeny little sound bites. You have to grab them immediately with 2 sentences. You have to make an argument within the space of 30 seconds, literally. So you've got to pare down what you're saying for these brief things. You really need some kind of extensive discussion. You can't go too long, as we find here with these ARCUK podcasts that we do. If it goes more than an hour, obviously you're going to lose people. Ideally a half hour to 40 minutes, right? But because that gives you enough time to make a point more than just 5 minutes. On the other hand, it's not so long that you're going to do those 10 points against the Constitution, bust their crow, and lose interest. I think that's an important lesson too.
Yes.
Just based on my own experience.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And now speaking of time, we're going to have to wrap up just slightly early today. So, this is, by the way, here is I don't know if we've displayed this yet, but this is an actual case for the cassettes. Oh, look, there's a couple of cassettes in here, everybody. These are little cassette tapes. Everybody
cassette tapes. I remember cassette tapes.
Yeah. I remember magnetic tape. Wow. They record things on magnetic tape.
Look at the back of it. It's the back of it
have.
here. Look at how cute is
There
that?
we have the good doctor in front of his microphone.
Edition 15.
So again, if you haven't heard this talk, it's worth a listen. Sometimes you think, well, triumphs and tribulations. Radio talk show host, I wasn't listening to that program. I'm not that interested. There's so many insights in here that apply, again, not just to those of us on the ARCUK trying to do our presentations, but we got to answer Bonnie's question too. But also just things that apply to your general life. A talk well worth listening to. I posted the link on my Facebook wall. Additional show notes will appear on there shortly. Bonnie is back in the super chat. Thank you for that. And she asks, is Ideas in Action available anywhere? And that's a great question.
We've adapted it to disc format. So hopefully sometime shortly it will be available via disc, because that is a great interview, I think. If I do say so myself, with Dr. Peikoff. He gave us hours of his time in his own home. And it was a brutal process just to edit it down to an hour because there was so much good material. But I hope to soon have it out in DVD, at least, format. And available. We've given Dr. Peikoff the permission on YouTube to use any parts of it that he wants, and I understand that they are going to start using parts of that interview for various purposes. So yeah, hopefully soon.
Excellent. And by the way, thank you, Apollo and Kirk. I think that they contributed a couple dollars. I don't know if we missed them earlier.
No, we mentioned it, but thank you.
Good.
That is appreciated.
Wanted to be sure.
Because we got to keep these shows going.
Yes.
Amy and I have now been joining James for these for the last month and a half, 2 months now. It's been quite a while now. And we appreciate everybody in the chat, everybody participating. The view counts have been good, which is great to see as well, because when we think of Leonard Peikoff, it's all too easy to say, well, there's OPAR, ominous parallels, the dim hypothesis, his 3 big works. And they're the 3, but the broad content from Leonard Peikoff, it's kind of just jaw-dropping. Jaw on the floor when you realize the power of objectivism through induction, or understanding objectivism, these long format lecture courses that he gave. But then even these small, which seem like they would be narrow topics, like triumphs and tribulations of a talk show host, and yet they're so rich. This is It's been extraordinary, James, to be involved with you on this, and I am looking
Yes.
forward to the next ones as well.
And we're going to continue doing these. We have radio shows, podcasts. Dr. Peikoff has given us an embarrassment of riches. And as you point out, he discusses everything from the highest end of epistemology, scientific induction, all the way down to the current issues, political and social issues of the day. Really astonishing, the scope of his brilliance and the applicability and relevance that objectivism has and will continue to have into the future.
Outstanding. Looking for it.
Beautiful.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everybody. We will see you next Friday.
Oh,
Take care.
actually, no. Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
Very
take care.
good.
Bye.